Good morning and welcome to Adult Storytime. Today is the second in our series from the book I Didn't Know That. It's a book by Karlen Evins, and this is a book that takes a look at sayings and phrases and what their original meanings were. Today we're going to be looking at the letter B and sayings and phrases that begin with that letter. So let's go ahead and we'll get started with our B's today. Backseat driver. Think backseat driver and you think of one who complains or one who thinks he can see better from the rear than from the front of a vehicle. But the original backseat drivers weren't complainers. Matter of fact, for what they were watching, they could see better. In the days of the early fire engines, there was a job for backseat drivers. Some needed to watch the ladder as engines rushed to the scene. As quick turns and abrupt stops were cause for accidents, a backseat driver was as vital a part of the fire team as the firefighters themselves. Baker's dozen. In the olden days, bakers who had shortchanged their customers by selling lighter loaves of bread were fined heavy penalties. So in 1266, English Parliament passed strict weight restriction laws that scared bakers into making sure they never came up short. Since weights could vary per loaf, it became customary for bakers to add a 13th loaf for good measure. So a baker's dozen came to mean 13. Ballpark number. In the late 1800s, with the increasing popularity of baseball, ballparks became the hangout for large events, both sports-related and otherwise. Political candidates often found ballparks the best setting for their rallies, but because no tickets were sold for these events, newspaper reporters were forced to estimate a ballpark number in covering the attendance. When one party would overestimate its attendance for the press, the rival party would in turn do the same, and as a result, ballpark figures turned out to be very rough, often inaccurate counts. Beating around the bush. No need beating around the bush unless you're a hunter looking for game. As many hunters will tell you, it is sometimes necessary to scare the game into running or flying before one can shoot. Beating the bushes was a customary hunting procedure long ago. Yet, for one who really did not enjoy the sport of killing an animal, beating around the bush was also a way to scare off game so that nothing was left for the confrontation. Bedlam. In referring to a madhouse, Bedlam can be taken quite literally, as there was one named just that in London in the mid-13th century. Originally, the site was a priory called St. Mary's of Bethlehem. Later, the name was shortened to Bethlehem, and then later, Bedlam. Some 300 years later, the site was turned into a house of detention for the mentally insane. Beyond the pale. Pale we take from the Latin word palus, which was a stake or boundary marker that fenced the territory under rule by a certain nation. Paling or pickets were quite common as boundary markers in Roman times. Those believed to be beyond the bounds of social or moral decency were once literally exiled beyond the pale or beyond the confines of civilization as determined by the townspeople. Black ball. Early social clubs in England had a practice of voting for their initiates by dropping white balls or marbles into a ballot box. Those voting against a particular candidate dropped a black ball, hence the term. While the term was first coined in the late 1700s, the custom dates back to ancient Greek and Roman times. Even our word ballot today refers to voting by little balls. Blimp. Goodyear didn't come up with the word. The non-rigid aircraft we today call the blimp originated in 1914. At that time, England was experimenting with two types of non-rigid airships, the A-Limp and the B-Limp. The former version never quite made it off the ground, but version B of the Limp aircraft became famous and today is known as Blimp. Bulls and bears. The symbols we use today to refer to the status of the stock market actually began with the London stock market long ago. There, trading notices were posted, literally, on cork bulletin boards by hand. The British brokers of the 18th century called these stock bulletins bulls, and you could find these bulls plastered on the board at the end of a heavy trading day. Obviously, when trading was less than busy, the bulletin board was bare, and the contrast of the two is how we came to call them bulls and bears today. And that's the B's of I Didn't Know That for today. We're glad you joined us. Hope you join us again next week. Until then, stay safe, be healthy, have a wonderful week.